When James Jimmy Zappalorti was murdered in 1990, it was the final brutal act in a life full of love, family, self-discovery, and not a small amount of pain and struggle. Thanks for joining me for the life and death of Jimmy Zappalorti. James Patrick Zappalorti was born in Brooklyn's Kings County in 1945. His family moved to the Charleston neighborhood of Staten Island in 1950 when he was 5 years old. The Zappalortis were a tight Italian Catholic family who went to church regularly. They were also a family of artisans. The family business was stained glass. They made for churches and businesses. Jimmy, as everyone called him, had trouble in school. Studying just wasn't his thing. Like many queer folks before him and after him, he was also bullied. In 1962, following the lead of his older brother Mike and one of their uncles, Jimmy asked his parents if he could join the Navy. He wasn't old enough, he was only 17. So they had to give their permission for him to join. He spent the rest of 1962 in basic training. He was stationed to the weapon transport ship, the USS Henrico. Zappalorti seemed to fit in with his shipmates, serving without too much trouble until 1965, when he had a shore leave that would shake him to his very core. In 1965, the Henrico docked in the port of Danang. They made a beeline to a bar that catered to soldiers. Inside, Zappalorti's shipmates goaded him into an encounter with a female sex worker. In the back room of the club, the woman took one look at Zappalorti and pronounced him a queer. He tried denying it, but she interrupted him, saying, "It's okay, nothing wrong with being a queer, but I just can't make any money off of you." He soon rejoined the other soldiers, but the episode threw Zappalorti. Not only was his secret exposed by a stranger, she had done it in a way that removed the cover of defensiveness, leaving him with not a little shame and nothing but the naked truth. When the shore leave was over and he was back on the ship, he encountered Ensign Johnson, who sensed that something was wrong with Zappalorti. Unconvinced by Zappalorti's "I'm all rights," Johnson ordered him to his quarters later that day. In his quarters, the 26-year-old Ensign Tom Johnson offered Jimmy a beer, and as Jimmy began to relax, he related to Johnson what had happened in the back room, saying, "For some reason I wasn't interested. That started me thinking, I don't know who I am." He talked about his strict Catholic upbringing and how homosexuality was a sin in the church. The ensign reassured Zappalorti that there wasn't anything wrong with him. Imagine what an extraordinary revelation this must have been for Zappalorti. For the first time in his life, to have somebody tell you that you're perfectly okay just the way you are, and to have it happen in the Navy of all places. The conversation ended with Ensign Johnson telling Jimmy that he'd been looking for someone, a friend he could relate to on a deeper level. Zappalorti replied, "Are you asking me out on a date?" Smiling, Johnson said, "Yes." Then and now, this would have been a violation with earth-shattering consequences. Ensign Johnson, being Zappalorti's superior, was not terrific, but before you judge too harshly, in 1965, homosexuality was illegal, not just in the military, but nearly everywhere. Just imagine how isolating and lonely it would have been for these two young people. Soon after this conversation, Johnson and Zappalorti took advantage of another shore leave and wandered the streets of Danang, wearing their uniforms. They went into a pawn shop that Johnson had visited before. The owner greeted them warmly. In addition to the camera and jewelry, Johnson bought a gold ring for Zappalorti as a token of their new friendship. One of the soldiers had warned Zappalorti to be careful around Johnson because there were rumors that Johnson was a homo. At the shop, the owner told Johnson that there was a new gang in the area who liked to beat up and rob and occasionally kill foreigners. This warning would prove prophetic. Finishing the drinks that the owner had given them at the shop, the two men decided to get a private room for the night, but unbeknownst to them, they were being followed. They went into a club where Johnson asked for a room upstairs. He had been there before. As they settled in, room service knocked, delivering their order. Before Johnson could close the door, a group of men who had followed them barged into the room, shouting abuses at the sailors, calling them all sorts of gay slurs. Johnson was singled out for abuse first. As Zappalorti was being restrained, Johnson was raped and beaten in front of Jimmy. Johnson did what he could to defend himself. The leader of the gang became angrier at Johnson's strength. He ordered two of his men to hold Johnson by either of his arms, shouting at him that he would never assault another man. Using his knife, he castrated Ensign Johnson and then shot him in the head. Somehow, in the frenzy and confusion, Zappalorti was able to escape by jumping out of a window to the street below, leaving Johnson, the first person who had seen him fully, the first person offering the possibility of romantic love, butchered and viciously murdered right before his eyes. Running for his life, Zappalorti was saved from certain death by a car of Navy officers who just happened to be driving down the street when they spotted a Navy guy running down the alley in their direction. Even as the military officers protected Zappalorti, the gang pursued him. They would not stop until shots were fired by one of the officers, striking one of the gangsters in the arm. Finally, the gangsters retreated down the alley and out of sight. The men who killed Ensign Johnson were arrested, and Jimmy Zappalorti was treated for his external wounds. But the brutality of what he had seen and what had been done to him would haunt him for the rest of his life. The Navy may do a better job now of dealing with members and their families, but according to the Zappalorti family, in 1965, the family wasn't told what happened to Jimmy. They didn't explain, the Navy didn't, why Jimmy's letter stopped. When the family reached out, they say they got no response from naval officials. It wasn't until they contacted the American Red Cross that they were able to find their brother and son in a military hospital, now in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Having found their son and brother, the family immediately drove down to the hospital to see Jimmy. They were greeted by a doctor who told them that Jimmy had suffered a severe mental and physical trauma. They were told that they needed to be gentle with him. Then the doctor asked the family if they knew that James was a homosexual. His brothers and sister and mother tried to take on the idea. His father rejected the notion out of hand. The doctor went on to tell the family that James's attempt to keep his sexuality a secret was tearing him apart. Jimmy was honorably discharged from the military, and Mickey, his older brother, took him under his wing, teaching him how to make stained glass in the family's business. When their father would blow up at Jimmy's now erratic behavior, like showing up late for work and sometimes not at all, it was Mickey who would come to his defense. The Jimmy that returned home from Vietnam, like many veterans today, was suffering from PTSD. He struggled with bouts of depression, which he began to treat by drinking alcohol to excess. He spent his weekends in Manhattan's Greenwich Village playing the piano at a gay piano bar. While this was great for his identity as a gay man, it helped to foster his trouble with alcohol into full-blown alcoholism. His family begged him to get help, and he finally did, kind of. In 1967, Zappalorti found a soft place to land on the shore of Arthur Kill River in Staten Island. The Arthur Kill is a tidal strait in the New York-New Jersey Arbor estuary between Staten Island, New York, and several counties in New Jersey. Jimmy liked the peace and contemplation of Arthur Kill so much that in 1969, he began to build a two-room getaway from his family home that his family affectionately called the Shack. As a finishing touch, Zappalorti hung a large chandelier in the red maple that draped the patio he'd built. The place had an outhouse and no running water, so he spent a great deal of his time at his parents' house, often spending the night in the bedroom that was kept for him and eating the meals that his father would prepare. According to friends and family, as the gay liberation movement grew in the 70s and 80s, Jimmy began to grow prouder of his sexuality. He enjoyed his trips to Manhattan, and even though he was mugged on more than one occasion, he was unbothered. He wasn't afraid of anything, except maybe of his disapproving father. On one early morning in 1985, after getting home around 2 a.m., a bit drunk, Jimmy was rummaging through the family fridge for something to eat, a habit that irritated his father to no end. Angry and awake, his father stormed into the kitchen, shouting that Jimmy was wasting his time in the city with all those queers. Jimmy responded, "That's because I'm a queer too. Get it?" The argument became physical. When his mother tried to separate the two, she was knocked to the floor, which ended the fight. Before his father stormed upstairs to his bedroom, he told his 38-year-old son he wanted him out of the house. Jimmy moved into the basement of his brother's house. In 1989, just as Jimmy was beginning to feel more comfortable with himself and having reconciled with his father, who had asked his son to come back home, just as life was beginning to be a little sweeter, two teens moved to Staten Island and their hatred and rage would become a threat to Jimmy Zappalorti's very existence. Before 20-year-old Michael Taylor and 26-year-old Philip Sarlo collided with Jimmy Zappalorti, they had already been arrested and served jail time for kidnapping and assaulting a gay man in 1986 with a tire iron. On a day in May of 1989, Jimmy was doing what he enjoyed, which was mowing the lawn of a neighbor. He was wearing one of his favorite summer warm weather outfits, cut-off shorts, a red cut-off t-shirt, a cowboy hat, and a pair of cowboy boots, which was a standout in conservative Staten Island. Most folks in the neighborhood knew Jimmy and liked him, except for the bullies who had been harassing him at a neighborhood bar a few nights earlier. When Taylor and Sarlo saw Jimmy, they started yelling abuse at him about what he was wearing. Taylor yelling to Sarlo, "Look, Phil, that's a fucking queer again, parading around in shorts." Zappalorti didn't show any fear, and he told the two to beat it. He had to get back to work. Seeing they weren't getting a rise out of him, they left him alone. Jimmy didn't drive, which increased the number of times he'd run into the bullies. On January 22nd, 1990, Zappalorti went into the corner store near his parents' house to pick up some groceries for the family dinner. As he stepped out of the store, the bullies seemed to be waiting for him. He ignored them at first, but they wouldn't stop calling him names. And then he told them that he was sick and tired of them making fun of him. Infuriated that Jimmy would stand up for himself, Taylor yelled, "You're just a fucking faggot." Jimmy replied, "It takes one to know one." The encounter was interrupted by a police car that pulled up. When he finally made it back to his parents' house, his father was furious that it had taken him so long, but Jimmy didn't tell his father what had happened. His father's annoyance subsided, and the three enjoyed a dinner the way they had on many other occasions. Little did they know how precious this meal would be. Around 6 or 7 o'clock, after they'd had dinner, Jimmy's dad, Mike Sr., was heading off to an Al-Anon meeting where he was a sponsor. His father asked Jimmy what he was going to do that evening. Jimmy said he would clear up the dishes, spend some time with his mother, and then walk back to the shack, relax with a beer and a copy of The Taking of Pelham 123. His father asked him if he'd spend the whole night there. Jimmy told his father that he'd be back at their house, around 10:30 that night. His father loaded their dog up into the car and drove away. As he was driving towards his meeting, he passed the two bullies, who recognized his car. Spotting him, they decided that Jimmy must be alone at the beach house, and they headed over to settle the score. Jimmy, by this time, was nestled snugly in the candlelit shack warmed by his kerosene lighter. The two bullies entered through the unlocked door in the back of the house. Jimmy yelled for them to get the hell out of his house, followed by Taylor punching him in the stomach and yelling, "I told you we'd get you." Zappalorti was facing the same brutal end. He had escaped in that Danang hotel room, and except for a gang, 40 years later, it was two angry teenagers. He was taunted by homophobic slurs. He was punched and kicked until he lost consciousness. When the bullies were satisfied that Zappalorti was out, they sat down and drank his beers, with Taylor telling Sarlo that felt good. At some point, Zappalorti came to, yelling for the men to get out of his house. Sarlo grabbed Jimmy by both arms and held him as Taylor brandished his 5-inch knife. Taylor demanded Zappalorti's wallet. Jimmy told him he wasn't giving him anything. Taylor stabbed Jimmy Zappalorti in the stomach. Zappalorti screamed and Sarlo let go of him, yelling at Taylor, "Jesus, I didn't think you were going to stab him." Sarlo would later tell the prosecution, as he lay dying, he could hear Jimmy saying, "Hail Mary, full of grace," ending with the words, "Now at the hour of our death." Taylor told him to shut up and grabbed him by the hair and cut Jimmy's throat. Then, to ensure that he was dead, Taylor stabbed him 2 more times in the stomach and in the chest. According to his confession, Sarlo backed out in horror. Taylor looked down at the dead Jimmy Zappalorti and spat out the words, "That's what you get when you fuck with me, you queer bastard." When they were sure he was dead, they ransacked the house for valuables, but stopped to drag Jimmy's body out of his house and down to the shore. They tried throwing the body into the Arthur Kill River, but his arm was caught by the rope that Zappalorti had put up in case he ever needed it. As it turns out, that rope would make the difference in finding his body and having it wash into the river. Not finding enough things of value in Zappalorti's house, the bullies, now murderers, headed to his parents' house. Around 9 p.m., Mary Zappalorti, Jimmy's mother, was home alone when the two murderers broke into the house, going from room to room, taking jewelry and cash, and anything that looked valuable. Jimmy's mother, who was disabled, was in a back room watching television. Roused by the noise, Mary Zappalorti made her way downstairs, where the murderers were standing in the door, now pretending to be friends of her son Jimmy. According to Sarlo, he had prevented Taylor from killing Mary Zappalorti. When her husband came home, they called the police to report the break-in and burglary. They were yet to learn the worst thing of all. The following morning, Jimmy's father, who would normally have been annoyed that his son hadn't come home, had spent a disturbed night of sleep worrying about Jimmy. At his parents' urging, Mickey, or Michael Jr., headed over to the shack to see if Jimmy had overslept. What he found instead was his younger brother dead and bloody. He wept uncontrollably, pulled himself together, and drove back to his parents' house to deliver the world-destroying news and to call the police. Within an hour of his call, Jimmy's little shack was crawling with police. The fatal wounds were to the jugular and the stab wound to the right chest. Talking to his family and neighbors, and to the owner of the corner store that Jimmy frequented, Taylor and Sarlo quickly became the primary suspects. A few days later, on January 24th, 1990, Sarlo and Taylor, trying to keep a low profile, had decided only to keep the cash they'd found at the Zappalortis, discarding all the other items in the street. Mary Zappalorti had identified the murderers from the night of the break-in. 2 days later, as Sarlo and Taylor drank in their favorite hangout, the police showed up. The murderers made it to the parking lot, but it was crawling with cops, so they went back into the bar. When confronted, Taylor jumped onto the bar and started throwing bottles of booze at the officers, hitting one of them in the face. When he regained consciousness, he and his partner cuffed Taylor. Sarlo was hiding in the bathroom, but was soon tracked down, and the two were arrested. While Taylor was being held on murder charges, Sarlo escaped to Florida, but he was soon returned into custody. As in the majority of cases, the murderers never went to trial because there was a plea deal. Taylor received 23 years to life, and Sarlo was sentenced to 18 years to life. On May 30th, 1997, Sarlo died in New York's Wenda Correctional Facility. Before his death, Sarlo reached out to the Zappalorti family, offering his apology, acknowledging Jimmy's humanity. Taylor continues to be housed in Danang, New York. Jimmy's death came at a terrible high point of attacks and murders of queer people in New York and New Jersey, and the community began to organize. And so did Jimmy's family. In some ways, the brutality of his death gave his life a painful clarity. When the bar that Jimmy played in gave a tribute to him, his brother Robert made a point of coming into the city to be there to see the people that Jimmy knew. The gay community in New York wrapped their arms around the family. So did the members of their Catholic church and the community on Staten Island. In 2000, after 12 years of struggle, protections for sexual orientation were finally added to New York law. The street where Jimmy Zappalorti lived had his name added to it. Even though Jimmy's father struggled with accepting that his son was gay, there was no doubt that his father adored his son. He said he would forever miss the times that Jimmy would put his arms around him and say to him, "I love you, Father." When asked what he thought when he thought about his son, he replied, "He was my baby." I want to dedicate this episode to Ensign Tom Johnson and my pal Robert, who served in Vietnam as a conscientious objector, and to all the queer folks who just wanted to serve with honor and distinction and to make it home for whatever the rest of life held for them. When it comes to sharing the stories of the life and deaths of queer people on this channel, I do my best to remain objective in that I can see the larger project of weaving together all of these stories. But every now and then, there's somebody whose life and death, of course, strikes me deeply, and that is certainly the case with Jimmy Zappalorti. I grew up on the Eastern Seaboard, and I had never heard of his story until recently. Reading and using Stained Glass Windows, The Life and Death of Jimmy Zappalorti by his brother Robert, gave me a bird's eye view into the Zappalorti family and a look behind the headlines into some of Jimmy Zappalorti's life. It has truly been an honor to share some of Jimmy Zappalorti's story with you. Please join me in sharing his story with others. Thanks for joining me. See you next time.